Hi, I'm Duane Newton, and welcome to Navigating Your Path. In this episode, I get to chat with my good friend and fellow University of Rochester CPEP Fellowship alum, Dr. Linoj Samuel. Linoj is the division head of clinical microbiology at Henry Ford Health, just down the road from me in Detroit, Michigan. Our discussion was a perfect example of why I love to do this. In all the years I've known Linoj, I never knew that he grew up in Kuwait and had to flee with his family through Iraq during the first Gulf War. He talked about how that experience impacted he and his family and gave him a very human perspective on military and political conflict. We shared stories of the impact of our fellowship training and how the mentoring we received from Marilyn Menegus truly shaped our careers. As the title of this episode shows, we still hear her voice in our heads. Linoj also talked about his journey of service in our profession and how important it is for him to stay grounded and connected when facing adversity. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Linoj Samuel. Thanks for your willingness to chat with me. I think that the approach that I wanted to take is just talking with people about their journey, where they came from and how they got to where you are now, and recognizing that everybody's story is unique. And I think that those unique experiences provide a lot of insight to people about, the kinds of things that we all go through, or, that we go through on that journey. And I know that some of it will resonate. But I think more importantly, what I feel like this gives us an opportunity to do is, step inside your shoes a little bit and allow people to get to know you and maybe feel a little more connected with you as a person. And, so when you go to ASM next week or whatever meeting, maybe folks that have listened would feel comfortable coming up and chatting with you and see you for the approachable person that you are. So thanks for your willingness to step into the circle and have a conversation.
Yeah, no. Thank you for having me on, for sure.
I think what I think is always really interesting is to start from, kind of where you grew up and what your family life was like. And I mean, that background has always provided some interesting stories from people. So
Mhm.
what's your origin story, Linoj?
Yeah. So I actually, although my family is originally from India, my parents moved to the Middle East sometime in the 60s. And so I was born there and grew up in the Middle East, and spent most of my time there, aside from maybe a year or so when we had to leave when the first Gulf War broke out.
So where in the Middle East?
It was in Kuwait. Yeah. So, I mean, from a standpoint of like, what was that bringing? Like, I mean, those are really wealthy countries, right? And so, even though we were solidly middle class, I mean, we grew up in what I would say is it was fairly good. I can't complain about my childhood, and so, aside from maybe the war part that I could have done without. But I think that overall, but from a very young age, I just was always interested in, you're growing up at an age where we had like one TV channel you had to watch, and there was not really great access to internet aside from dial-up. You read a lot of books, and I would read newspapers from like front to back because that's how bored I was out of my mind. And I was always interested in like outbreaks and things of the infectious disease world, and I can't explain why that over other things. And so I always thought at some level I'd be involved in infectious diseases and microbiology in some form.
So, but you kind of glossed over this part really quickly. you were in Kuwait, and you were in Kuwait during the first Gulf War.
Yeah, so I was
What
probably
was that? Oh my gosh, that I didn't realize that. And tell me a little
yeah,
more about that.
I was probably about eighth or ninth grade at that time, and we woke up one morning and thinking about, we'd never been exposed to any kind of warfare at any point. I don't know that my upbringing was really different from your average American here. But we woke up one morning and there were tanks in the streets and soldiers, and turns out that the neighboring country had invaded us, and most of you know the story. And so there was sort of a couple of months of nothing happening after that because we were stuck there. We couldn't leave. Parents couldn't go to their jobs. We couldn't go to school. And so you were sort of locked down. But it was an interesting perspective to being in a war versus reading about a war. At that point, there was no fighting, although, there was a plane crash, a jet fighter crash in the field where we used to play soccer.
Mm.
And so there were shortages of food and other supplies, but it was not like we didn't starve or anything like that. What we didn't know was that we came across a lot of soldiers from the Iraqi army, and even though they were technically the enemy having invaded Kuwait, most of them were conscripts. I mean, some of them were like 16-year-old kids. They had a choice to be there in that
Not
matter.
much older than you.
Right, right. And most of them were hungry, looking for stuff to eat, and they had never seen the kind of like, what we consider fairly average, having a microwave and things like that. They had never seen things like that. And they're coming from a country with a lot more oil than Kuwait. And so it was clear that they had a different upbringing and different circumstance than we did. And so, anyways, long story short, we realized that nothing good was going to happen, and we had to leave. So we ended up driving in a convoy out of Kuwait all the way through Iraq, because at the time the U.S. forces were building up on one side and the Iraqi forces on the other side. So we drove all the way through Iraq, ended up in Jordan. But turns out everyone had the same idea. So we're there with 250,000 people trying to get out Jordan, and there weren't any flights to take us back to. Um, we had a house back in India, and so we were not technically refugees to a place to go. We just couldn't get there. So we ended up spending, I would say, maybe like 5 or 6 days in a refugee camp in the middle of the desert. And that was, I mean, an eye-opening experience. Again, we were with the Red Cross. They really took care of us, but you're in a tent in the desert. There's not a blade of grass to be seen or another building for miles around. Um, and they got us food, they got us water, and there were other people who went before us who didn't have that kind of organization, who suffered a lot. So we were fortunate in that regard. But for my parents, I mean, as a teenager, you have no sense of danger. You're like, oh, this is cool. My parents, when I look back, they were freaking out. They were like, they didn't
Yeah.
expect to be in a refugee camp, and but you get a feel for what it's one thing to read about these things, and another thing to experience that in real time, right?
What did you like? Are there some kind of long-lasting feelings or perspectives that came from that experience that you carried with you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people have conversations about wars and whether they justify or not, and sometimes they are. But I think what we lose sight of is there's a constituency that is not fighting, that is just trying to live and get away. We left Kuwait with just the things we could carry, right? What if you get back in a suitcase? An entire lifetime left behind, not even the money in our bank accounts because we can access those, right? So you're leaving with just what you can carry, and going to a country you didn't grow up in, and on the way you're stuck in this camp instead. And so I think it really does make you think about, okay, even with what's going on now in the world, there are people that have nothing to do with either side that are struggling, and I think there always needs to be a thought for those people. It also makes me appreciate the work that the Red Cross and other agencies do out there, because they took good care of us, even though it was a difficult situation. um, Eventually we did make our way back to Kuwait, to India, sorry, and spent a couple of years there. But that also changed my perspective, because I was in a completely different environment, different language, different, and you learn how to adapt to situations because you have no choice, right? And I think most of us are more capable of things than we think we are. Um, and we adjusted.
My I had an experience that had an impact on me. It was nowhere near what you described, but my dad was in the military, and when we lived in Germany when I was real pretty young, second grade through fifth, like half of fifth grade, and we took a trip to Berlin. And at the time, this was in the early to mid 70s. It was, there's still East Germany. Berlin was split into East and West. And I actually got to tour through East Germany. And, the wall is still up, very much Cold War, Soviet era. And it was really impactful how different the other side of the wall was. And in the environment, there was a lot of deconstruction, buildings that were falling apart and rubble, I remember. And the energy was very dark. And people, just kind of kept to themselves and their heads down. And clearly we were, Westerners, and but it had a huge impact on me even as a kid. And it was one of many situations that happened over time as a kid, as a military kid, where you're in environments that are not, they're a lot different than what you're used to. And I think, the easiest way to describe it is it makes the world seem a lot smaller place. And you see how connected we really all are, and that they're just people trying to do the best that you can. And it also made me, appreciate and recognize I had a different experience, and I had a better experience, and there were things to be grateful for. So I think it's interesting how I think it's very valuable for people to have that kind of experience. Any kind of experience where you're getting out of your circle and you get to
Yeah,
see.
a comfort zone. Although this was not by choice, to be clear. But crossing over into Iraq was really interesting because, again, Iraq has more oil than Kuwait, but it was very underdeveloped. The people were living, I think a lot of the towns we passed through, people were clearly struggling. And so it was interesting to see that sort of different perspective across the border, as you said. And later on, I think that we were fortunate to return because the U.S. military came in and they, with their allies, they liberated Kuwait because the Kuwaitis were being, arrested and tortured by by Saddam Hussein, really, not the Iraqi people, Saddam Hussein. And so I think that was really uh, that allowed a lot of folks to come back, and we were able to return to our jobs, and well, my parents were able to return to their jobs, and we got back, and a lot of the country had been looted. Everything that could be picked up was taken away, and a lot of people lost everything they had. But some random person had broken into our apartment and lived there and took care of all of our stuff, and so all of our stuff was there. And when my dad returned, he was like, "Oh, I'll just you can just be our roommate." And so there was a higher power looking out for us and everything, even our family albums, we got everything back.
Oh, wow.
When some people lost, had nothing left.
Oh, that's amazing. So you were telling a story then of, kind of your transition or where your interest in microbiology came from. So the bored kid who reads the newspaper to entertain himself gets fascinated with infectious diseases and kind of goes from there.
Yeah, so after high school, I went in to do an undergrad in medical microbiology. So it was actually an MLS degree that I did, it was a 4-year MLS degree that I did. And I realized that, I mean, I knew early on that I needed to do more. And so towards the end, I had applied for a master's program in the US, not knowing exactly how I would get where I wanted to go. But I knew I needed more training, more education. And so I ended up at the University of Arizona in the master's program, but I ended up quickly transitioning into the PhD program without actually completing the master's. Was fortunate enough to work with Dr. Richard Friedman who was doing a lot of work in TB. And somehow I showed up at the department without a mentor assigned to me. And he was like, well, you can hang around for a few months. And I did a few months, ended up becoming 5 years. So I was able to stay there, worked with TB. Um, I had a fantastic experience with some amazing people, but got a real exposure to some of the challenges of being in basic science research, right? Challenges of funding, of NIH work, of working with a bug that takes months to grow, and finding out, the 95% of of your graduate school work at months to nothing. It's that 5% that really gets you. Anyway, you learn so much from the 95%, right? And so that I think that's the common shared experience for most of us. But I think you learn a lot in those times.
It sounds like your experience, uh, it's very similar to mine, but that you learned that basic science as as a field of profession for your long term maybe wasn't aligned with what you wanted to do, or I mean, what was the feeling, or kind of what was the thought process as you were thinking about what your next steps were?
Right. So I had been so towards the end of my PhD, and I saw in real time how the struggles of NIH funding, and this is my mentor was someone who had had years and years of NIH funding, but towards the end was struggling with grant funding, and I saw the struggles going through, and I knew that I still wanted to go back into more clinical space, into more patient-facing roles, being directly engaged in clinical microbiology, but I didn't know anything about ASM, CPEP programs. I'd been to ASM and never been exposed to anything about CPEP programs. And luckily, there was one of his previous students who happened to have been who have gotten the CPEP fellowship, and I happened to have a random phone call with her, and she connects me to CPEP and ASM, that side of things. And so, of course, I applied. Of course, being an international student, it's a little challenging when these are competitive fellowships. At the time, there were far fewer fellowships than there are now, and not all of them were accepting students at the time. At the time, so I interviewed. I got one interview, and that was it. And that was at University of Rochester with our shared mentor, Marilyn Menegus. And I distinctly remember her telling me at the time, I've reminded of this many times since, that she thought I was a great candidate, but she thought I'd find my place elsewhere. And then maybe a month later, she calls and offers me the position. So I knew I wasn't first choice, but you know what? I could care less. I just wanted to get in, and I got in.
I wasn't the first choice either.
Yeah, so,
So
so for all those who are struggling out there, I think that there's always hope, and doesn't matter if you're the best candidate or not. You just got to be persistent and keep trying and hang in there. So I got in, and I think, as you see, the rest is history. I mean, I think that the CPEP fellowship was amazing experience, with Marilyn, with Dr. Hardy, with the extended family that are the CPEP fellows, past and present and future of that program. And I think Marilyn was central to that, and whether she's gone now, her memory, I think, lives strong in all of us, right? So,
do you have any favorite sayings or memories, or takeaways from that time
oh,
that you still like, it comes up, or that it just reminds you of her and that experience?
I mean, there's so many, from her party magic tricks that she did at parties to her sayings. I mean, you did learn from her some things that you should not do, even though she did them. And so she taught, even when she wasn't teaching, she was teaching you something, right? Um, but things like, oh, the data is the data, you catch yourself saying things like that, that you picked up from her along the way. But I think she was committed to her art and her craft in a way that I think most of us can only hope to
Yeah.
aspire to.
That was like, how many times you walk by her office and you see her, with a pile of set of data out in front of her, and she's got her pencil out and she's going through that, and
Yeah.
you think you're working late and it's 7 o'clock and you're heading home and she's still
Yeah. Yeah.
she's
And
in it.
I think the one thing I took away from her, maybe not so much her work ethic, because I don't think it's hard to match,
Yeah.
but I think is to always be inquisitive and ask questions. That even after 40 years in her career, she was still just as curious and always wanted to know. And she was always said about doing the right thing for the patient. The job is not just about metrics and numbers and budgets and whatnot. In the end of the day, I still tell people, like, I want to make sure that that person that came in got the right answer that they wanted, and I hope that I never get to a point where I don't care about that. I think that's what she taught us, I think.
I think that's spot on. And, I think that's a central part of, what we do in our jobs. And she certainly, was critical in helping to instill that.
Mm-hmm.
What, in that period, to me, it was the greatest time of my life. I mean, I felt that 2 years from a professional standpoint, it was just so fulfilling, but it wasn't without challenges. I mean, were some things that along the way, not necessarily just in your fellowship, what kind of bumps in the road did you face, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always dealing with people's perceptions of you and expectations. I mean, even just getting into the fellowship, my mentor was like, "Really, you got into that?" I mean, it's like, I was like, "Yeah, I think that um, there's always this, like, I think a lot of people start with imposter syndrome, and I think that should never hold you back from like trying for things that that others might think that you can't achieve for yourself.
So you felt like an imposter?
Oh, I mean, at some point, don't we always feel like imposters even now? And I think that at some point you just have to work through it and sort of, do it anyways. And so I think that to think that it- that you go through, and even with my mentor and seeing the struggle that he went through later in his career, and that's his story to tell. But I think that you can be successful if you want, and you can put yourself to crazy standards, but try to please others and meet standards others have for you. But in the end, um, all you can do is be the best you can be in the position that you're in, right? Um,
That's a very calm and kind of Zen approach to things. And you've always, like, from the first time that I met you, that's the energy that you project. This, like, don't get flustered, don't get worked up about things, and just kind of, you have this ability, it seems, to just let things kind of, water over a duck's back kind of thing. Is there anything that upsets you? Have you ever gotten upset and angry? And, I was thinking about it, like, I don't think I've ever seen Linoj mad,
I
outwardly.
think that I think all of us have a mask that we wear, right? There's things that get all of us flustered. I cannot think. I'm sure there's plenty of times that's.
I'm not talking about like teenagers at home kind
Oh
of.
yeah, yeah, I have two of them, so that's definitely a challenge. But even going back, you go back to your just getting into the fellowship program. Yeah, I got in, but then making that deadline, because I had a very short timeline between graduation and getting into the fellowship. And at the time, my mentor was having health issues and he wasn't available. And somehow, and again, I think, if you believe in a higher power, all that worked out because my mentor was having all these issues. My committee felt sorry for me. I was able to get out in time to make it to, then I didn't think I didn't have a publication at the point coming out of my PhD, but somehow I was able to work it through and get the publication while I was still in my fellowship. And even at the end of the fellowship, looking for jobs. And this is a theme even now. It's always been a theme, right? You go through what now? I just spent 11 years of schooling, and you're looking for the jobs and you realize that this is tricky, right? You're looking for a very specific kind of position. And actually Marilyn ended up keeping me for an extra month and a half because I was waiting for the right offer to come along. And she was generous in that regard. And she was like, no, you wait for it. And I had really, again, so thankful to have her as a mentor. And turns out it happened to be in Michigan, which is the state that my wife and I were looking to move to. Even though she thought I was crazy, but that's what worked out for us amazingly, And so I'm very grateful for all the people that have poured into me over the years. So we think about getting flustered. I think that a lot of times when I get flustered, I do, and all of us do. I have to remind myself. I think over the years, what you think makes you happy changes, right? And you should have shifting goals and perspectives, and these are what makes you happy. But I have to remind myself that if I see myself where I am now and the way I'm blessed now, and I tell myself 20 years ago, this is where you'd be, I'd be like, oh, this is amazing. But now that I have those things, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I got to deal with all this crap, right? But I have to remind myself that you've come a long way, and we need to keep that perspective of where we were, where we're at now, and how far we've come, right?
Yeah, I think that's very well said, because when you're in the middle of it, there's a certain kind of emotion that's around it. And, and you're running a million miles an hour, or you're dealing and handling, and, then there's a certain kind of pressure. And then maybe there's also this, forward looking part of you that's the next greatest thing, or, the next challenge, or the next finish line that you're trying to achieve. And you can lose a little bit of the perspective of how far you've come. And I think there's kind of, especially early on, and I remember feeling this way as a young person, trying to determine, what path am I going to go on? And first thing, I expected it to be very clear to me, and like kind of on a silver platter. Here it is. Here's where you're going to go. That was wrong. And then, once you figure that out, it's sort of like this exponential, ideally exponential, if not, at least linear kind of progression. And you look back on it, and if you actually tracked it from an emotional level, it's just like this up and down and up and down and up and down. And yet there's still progress, and there's still growth and development and maturity that happens. And I think it's hard to appreciate that and believe that that's especially when you're in one of those dips, that you are moving forward. But I appreciate you saying that, because it's something that I experienced, and I've spent some time. Even now, there's tough times you're going through, and like, there's a lot to be grateful for. I'm moving forward. Growth is still happening. And that's a great message. One of the things from your growth and development that I've always been very impressed with is the level of commitment to serve our profession that you've had, and the things that you've gotten involved in, and your contributions to the field. That's, again, like where you are now. It's been stepwise progression to reach these positions. But how did you get started? What are the things that you identified that resonated with you, that called you to serve and attracted you to serve? And how did you work on that process? Because I think, especially for a current fellow or someone who's just starting out in the field, they see the Linoj Samuels that has, all these years of experience, has been on all these committees, and they think, this is how I got to be like that if I'm going to be successful. But it can manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. And I'm just curious as to how yours, how you manifested yours.
Yeah, I think that one, I can't take a lot of credit for all that because I think a lot of people pour into, like I said, with Marilyn and others along the way. It's really people you meet along the way, the journey that sort of lift you up, right? And I still remember a lot of it has to do with making yourself available, right? And when you make yourself available, also being willing to give of yourself, your time, your energy to those things. So I think if you are willing to serve, then be willing to serve. Like, we struggle sometimes with people who say they're willing to serve, but then don't really come through on that. And that's a challenge. But I think that I'd like to say when I was given the opportunity that I made the most of it. But that was because of the people that gave me those opportunities. So Larry Gray early on, recruiting me into the ASM CPEP committee, the people at SCACM, so your regional microbiology, associations like SCACM and SCASM and all. I did a lot of work early on in SCACM, where it was an amazing way to get to know people, see how these organizations worked. And being in program planning, I got to meet a lot of people that gave those talks and connect with them. And then after that, it was Larry Gray recruiting me into ASM and CPEP. And honestly, it wasn't even that I had the best ideas on the committee or that I was the most effective. It was just that I was available. When something needed to get done, I was available and I tried to make myself. And I cared about the fellowships because that was what got me where I wanted to be. And so I think that those are the things. It really is being available, being willing to connect, network with people. And I think small organizations like SCACM, like SCASM, like PACV, a great way to connect and meet with people. Those are very helpful. The folks and to sort of encourage you. And hopefully when you get to that point, you're the person that encourages others, right?
Mhm.
We can't always just take. I still remember the first time we did an ASM symposium, and it was Amanda Harrington and Susan Butler-Rue that sort of like said, let's do this. And I was like, I'm like nobody. Why would I do an ASM symposium? And they dragged me into it, and I was like, oh yeah, we actually did this, and that's just like an
And
amazing,
you had a full room. That's hard.
yeah. So it was an amazing experience because again, we're all there with imposter syndrome, like feeding off of each other, and somehow it just worked. And so I think I'm thankful to a lot of people that helped me take those next steps on the way, and hopefully, all of us are doing the same for others.
You shared with me kind of along those lines this the Henry Ford Summer program for young scientists that you've been involved. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's a really interesting and important thing that you've been involved in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to overstate my involvement here because it's a once a year thing in the summer. I do a session. I'd like to do more, but the time is limited. I do a session on infectious disease and microbiology for up and coming like high school students in Metro Detroit, mostly in the Detroit city area. And I think again, it goes back to folks always tell me, well, I don't have time and to do things. And I think we all have a responsibility to make time for some of these things, right? There's always never going to be enough time to get everything done. And so it's a matter of setting priorities. And I think that even in a small way, if you can serve your community, and again, this is a very small way, but I think that that's what you need to do. Then create a national committee, the regionals with local stuff. And I think a lot of these kids are being exposed to a lot of things that are giving them misinformation, and any opportunity we have. And I have never been in a room where the high schools were engaged. I mean, they were always 100%. Obviously, I'm not approaching it from the perspective of lecture, right? But they've always been 100% engaged, really interested, and the feedback I've gotten has been amazing from them.
That's that's amazing, and I think it demonstrates this. One of the attributes of a leader is that desire to give back and to teach and to coach and to mentor, and those kinds of skills are not often um, the tools to use are not presented to us, and the practice at honing this, the use of those, developing the skills to use those tools are not available. And like making that pivot from being, that all that technical expertise and the clinical expertise that were part of our training and experience to, now you leave a fellowship and you're in a job where, that's actually very little of what you do. And most of what you do is leading. Can you talk about what that transition was like for you, and the challenges that you had, and the approaches that you've taken to overcome them, and going to be the kind of leader that you want to be?
Yeah, I think that the initial transition was very hard, as I'm sure you can imagine, right? I mean, I came in,
As I experienced
yeah,
as
uh,
well.
but the previous director had been gone for a while, and so that's not an ideal situation for the fellow coming out of the CPEP fellowship to go straight into a job where you're completely in charge of a full service 24/7 lab.
That hasn't had a director for.
Yeah, for several months, and that was less than ideal. And I probably called Marilyn a bunch of times along the way. You know, if you want to see me flustered, that would have been the ideal time. But you know what? The lab had some incredible medical lab scientists who had been there for 30, 40 years, and they humored me along the way, and I learned a lot and I grew with them. Sadly, many of them are retired now, but there were some incredible people in the lab that helped me along the way that I still fondly remember. But also, like you said, a lot of it is, yeah, where you're hired for your technical expertise, but a lot of it is people skills, right? Being able to connect with people, talk to them, interfacing with the other departments, and making connections to go beyond the lab, right? That is a huge part of your job. And I think that when I was on the CPEP committee, we tried to push that part of it with the fellowship training programs is, engage the fellows, not just in the science, but in the people skills. Like you're meeting with industry people, have the fellows in the room with them. You're meeting with your supervisors and it wasn't, on many occasions, I found that wasn't always the case, that the fellows weren't being involved in the administrative stuff, right? And so I think a key part is making sure that now a lot of it you're going to learn along the way. There's only so much you can teach in 2 years, right? And this is a little job where you learn your entire life. I learned something new today about my and so
What was that?
I'd rather not talk about it. It wasn't what I was happy to, my experience. But
To protect the innocent and
yeah,
identities.
but I think that, a lot of it is learning how to connect with people, communicate with them, and building relationships. A lot of the departments were were very positive with the fact that we reached out to them and connected with them because they didn't have those kind of connections before. And so the reason for that is not just for them, it's for you. And I learned so much from my colleagues in other departments and divisions. And so I think that's an important part of us growing is if you don't understand what people are doing with the results you generate or how it impacts their work, then you're probably not doing a great job. Or you're probably not doing as good a job as you could.
What about on the flip side, if you kind of go more back on the inside of the lab, creating this culture, creating the kind of culture that you want to have. There's like this term, I don't know if you like it or not, but I like the term psychological safety. Like you create an environment where people feel psychologically, emotionally safe, where they feel comfortable bringing up issues, maybe challenging a perspective politely.
Yeah.
How do you what are the kinds of things that you've done to create that kind of environment in your life?
I think that I learned very early on that when I think I know I have all the answers, that's exactly when I don't know what I'm doing. And so asking questions, listening to people, and a lot of times this listening is it's not just because you're being nice, it's because I'm trying to save my own behind sometimes. And listening gives me a lot of insight on things that are going wrong that need to be fixed. But from the beginning, I told folks I'm going to keep my door open. You can walk in anytime. And they know that. Even now, I leave my door open whenever I can, so they can walk in at any time. We've also had the benefit of being very lean oriented. So what that means is that if someone comes up and says, "Well, we have this problem, we'd like it fixed," and I say, "Well, well, here's what you do. You have the lean training, you create a team, collect the data, and you're empowered to fix the problem, right?" And that's been a departmental approach, not just mine. But you're empowered to fix the problem. And a lot of times, and we've had people that really step up and grow in leadership skills because they were empowered to fix the problem. And maybe that wasn't necessarily the way I would have done it, but it solved the problem. So part of it is also being, I think, understanding that you don't always have all the answers, but maybe your job is just to facilitate people getting to the point where that answer becomes manifest, right? And everything doesn't have to be a quick fix. The quick fix is all for part of the problem. You fix something and then you don't really fix it because you never look to the data. Marilyn would say the data is the data. You don't have the data, and a lot of times people will be screaming out this huge problem, and you reflect the data and it's not there. But then they're satisfied because they've seen the data themselves and realize, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. But there's times there are things we didn't anticipate, and I think that's part. Is always asking questions, right? And then listening to what the answers people have to say, getting multiple perspectives of it, and understanding that maybe you don't always know everything, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. I think you identified all things that are critical in being open, listening, questioning, being receptive to seeking out and being receptive to others' opinions, admitting when you don't know, and even if you've made a mistake or gone down the wrong path, and the data will tell you if you've gone down the wrong path, so all those things. And I think those are really important lessons. And I think that I reflect on the time, my 20 or so, 20 plus years in the lab, and think about opportunities that I had to do that better, and how I might approach things differently if given the opportunity again, to do that. But I think that you're in a great place, and I admire the things that you've done so much. And I think it's maybe to kind of wrap up a little bit, what do you feel like is left for you to accomplish? What do you want to do? Where do you see yourself going? I don't know where you feel like you are on your career continuum timeline, but what are the things that continue to interest you, or challenges that you feel like you haven't taken on yet that you want to take on?
Well, first let me say I really appreciate those compliments coming from you, Duane. I respect how much I respect you as a colleague. I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. Let's be clear for the record, and most of it is when I think I know what I'm doing, and you get a little cocky. It's not even the first couple of years. It's later on when you think you get a little cocky and you start thinking you know what you're doing. Then you start making snap decisions. You're like, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. Always a good idea to wait, think, step back from the situation, and get other perspectives on it. And so that's it's always a learning process. As far as where to go, I just want to make sure for the record, as of this recording, I'm still in my 40s. So, so
I don't think it's going to take that long to get this up and posted. So you're still going to be in your 40s.
yeah. So it's hard. It's
Early career, your early career.
Yeah. No, I don't think I can see that anymore. Definitely mid career. But I think that that's always a question that's challenging, right? I think that you ask yourself the same question,
I
and
did. That's exactly when I started thinking about these things, like what,
yeah,
and I started questioning when I, at that point, for me, and I'm not trying to put this on you, but I think, that it was exactly the time when I started thinking, I feel like there's more for me to do. I don't know exactly
right.
what it is. And, that was the topic of, uh, the first episodes of the podcast is talking about that whole process. But, for
Yeah.
you, like, where you
You know,
going?
and I've had the privilege of serving on CPEP, on CPHMC with ASM, and being engaged in a lot of stuff. But that my term on that committee is coming to an end now. So the question really is, what do we do now? And I think that the older you get, the harder it is to really push yourself to enter spaces that are new. Because, when you're younger, you need those spaces. But when you're settled and in a career that's sort of a solid trajectory, you're like, well, I don't know if I need to do that. And I think that it's important to keep challenging yourself, and some things will work out, some things won't. And I think I can definitely say this institution is challenging me in many ways, because we've got our we're aligning with Michigan State University. We're merging multiple hospitals. And some level, you're like, you know what, I'm getting too old for this. But at other level, I think that the challenge is what keeps you going. So I don't know if I have the answer to your question. I think that at some level we're all still figuring out where we need to go, whether that's here or in a different role. Like we're getting more into research and more into other administrative roles. Some of which you're like, is this really what I want to do? And you might think that this is what you want to do, don't want to do, but some of those things you won't know until you try them.
Mhm.
And that's okay. And some of those things you try and they won't work out, and some of them will. I really, at some level, would love to get back into having a global perspective on things, being involved in that. My original interest was in global infectious disease and clinical microbiology, and how that happens, I have no idea. But I'd love to be able to give back a little bit more, of what I took benefit of.
That the field is really changing, and some of it is it's being put upon from external forces. But I think from a positive standpoint, the relationships that we have with industry, and the number of clinical microbiologists that are on the inside of product development on the industry side is at the highest it's ever been. And um, I think that's certainly an area where you personally and Henry Ford as an institution has really grown and developed and shined brightly in that. And these companies are all, they're global organizations too. And I think that's that's always been, it's been a little bit of a behind the curtain kind of part of our profession that is um, much more much more open and interactive and collegial. And not that it ever wasn't, but I think, just for the reasons that I said, that, I see that transition over the last several years has been pretty strong. And how do you see those kinds of interactions shaping or impacting you, or attracting you?
Yeah, I think that it's really good to see a lot of CPEP fellows or CPEP trained ADM certified individuals now in industry. That, I think when you and I were starting out, that wasn't the case. Um, and so, not that there were fantastic people in industry, but there's so many more now. And I think the companies are better off for it. I think they have a better ear to what the community is saying, what the clinical needs are, and a better handle on product development. And I think that it's fantastic to see how well some of our colleagues are doing in the industry space, some of whom made the transition later in their careers as well. So I think it's also opened the doors for collaborations that are really meaningful, and I think where you're doing some real science and some really interesting stuff. And so it's opened more opportunities for CPEP fellows or ABMM certified individuals to really grow in other capacities. So it's really good to see that. I think that, some of the trends, we've sadly seen cuts in public health funding. And so we've seen some loss of positions there. And so hopefully industry can compensate for that. And I think that there are some concerns. I think with the future, we're seeing this greater lab consolidation. We don't know what that means. And it is an area of growing concern. What happens with the increasing sort of consolidation or corporatization of clinical micro labs? What does that mean for the future? What does that mean for innovation? What does that mean for patient care? What does that mean for the next pandemic? We don't know. And I think we all have a role. We all have a voice in how that develops. And I think it's important to do your day job and be engaged there. But I think that we all have a stake in how things develop in this field, and I think it's important we all remain engaged.
The last question I'll ask you is something I think I've asked everybody that I've talked to. And it's not, what would you do differently? But it's if you had a message for your younger self, the teenage, high school, going, or maybe college, wherever, whatever age you pick, what would you go back and tell young Linoj, whatever version of young Linoj that you care to, that needs to hear from 40-something Linoj?
Yeah.
What would you tell that guy?
I like your analogy when you step back and look at your life, there's a steady, there's a steady growth that you see, but in that moment, you're looking at the dip, right? It's like the stock market. You keep buying and selling, you're always going to lose out. You try to play the market, and it never works out. You're going to hold for a long term, ideally, right? For growth. And so it's in that moment, things might be difficult, challenging, or not outlook. I think that you have to really have the long term perspective, be committed, work hard, connect with people, rely on others, and I think that, and if you're in a position to strengthen or support somebody else, do that. I think a lot of folks would benefit. You may not think so, that others would benefit from your support, but I cannot understate what value you can give to somebody else. You don't have to be someone who's the pinnacle of their career to strength to lift up other people. You can do it all the way along the way, and don't give up those opportunities. Like I said, I benefit from that. The other thing I would say is that to anyone out there is really, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room or the most qualified, and you can still accomplish a lot. And I think that I still feel like I'm scratching the surface. I feel like there's so much that could be done. And again, all of it because of the support of so many people who are far more capable and smarter. I was even in my graduate school lab, I was probably the not the smartest person there as well, right? I'm not being falsely humble here. I'm just stating the facts here. I'm saying that you can be persistent and get through and do a lot of things just by being available, being intentional, and in the role that you have, being responsible, right? We see people stepping into roles and then just not doing anything with it, and that's the biggest frustration I often come across.
There's so many, you maybe stated it another way. There's so many different attributes that bring value to the role that you're in, the path that you're on, and yes, book smarts or technical competence is the component of that, but there are so many other things that you bring to the table that you've shared with us today that make you the outstanding person that you are. And I'm super grateful to have had the time to chat with you and for others to get to hear about that too and experience it. And I'm also grateful to have you not just as a colleague, but as a friend. And I enjoy immensely every opportunity that we have to get together. I think, this might be the first time we haven't laughed about something. Maybe we did laugh earlier. I'll have to go back and check the tape, but I always laugh when I'm with you two, and you're a super cool dude, and I appreciate you. Linoj, thanks for being on here.
Oh, thanks, Duane. And I think that you're one of those people that did support me over the years, and I think that value this interaction. I think the last thing I would say, and you've encouraged so many others, I know you have, and so I think you're a role model in that regard. I think the other thing I would say is that in the end, the science is still an important part of who we are and what we do, right? And I would be remiss or like Marilyn would be haunting me if I didn't say the data is the data and let that drive. Right? Again, I think in the end, whether it's you're in an administrative role or you're doing good science, and I've seen this many times, people lose focus on, and then what we are still scientists, right? And I think it's important to let the data drive your decision making. And I've seen people lose focus on what we're here to accomplish, right? And what is your goal? We're still doing the right thing by the patient, and making sure that there's good science backing it up. Right?
That's I can't say anything better than what you just said, and I will try. And that's a great way to wrap it up. And I think that will be the title of this episode. The data is the data. Thanks again, Linoj.
Thank you.
I'll chat with you again soon. If you're enjoying navigating your path, please be sure to like or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to directly connect with me, you can reach out via my podcast email, which is listed in the description of this episode. It also contains the links to the podcast website and YouTube channel where you can check out more of my content. Feel free to reach out if you'd like to share any comments or even make suggestions about future topics to discuss. I'd also love to hear from you if you have suggestions for people for me to interview, or even if you'd like to be interviewed by me. You can also contact me if you'd like to learn more about what it is that I do as a professional development coach. I look forward to having you join me next time. Take good care.